Hey guys, tonight we begin with humanity's oldest friend and worst decision, alcohol. From ancient temples to medieval taverns, we've been finding creative ways to ruin mornings since civilization began. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before civilization, before writing, before anyone figured out how to boil water without burning down the hut, someone accidentally invented getting drunk. It happened around 7000 BCE in Neolithic China, when a farmer left a pot filled with rice, honey, and fruit sitting around too long. The mixture fermented, as all neglected things do, and created a mysterious bubbling potion that smelled like both curiosity and regret. At some point, a human, possibly hungry, possibly stupid, definitely bored, decided to drink it. That moment, right there, was the dawn of human history. Not the invention of the wheel, not the discovery of fire, but the instant someone looked at a suspicious jar of spoiled fruit and said, "Yeah, I'll risk it." The first sip was confusing. The second felt amazing. By the third, our prehistoric hero was trying to explain emotions to a goat. The world spun, trees started looking philosophical, and everyone suddenly seemed like a really good dancer. It must have felt like touching the divine, which is probably what they told their friends before collapsing into a pile of mud. Congratulations, humanity. You've just discovered alcohol, and 5 hours later, the concept of consequences. Archaeologists later found 9,000-year-old pottery jars at the site of Jiahu, still stained with traces of that ancient brew, a blend of rice, honey, and hawthorn fruit. It's the earliest known cocktail, the prehistoric equivalent of whatever's in the fridge. Chemical analysis confirmed it was fermented, which means this wasn't an accident anymore. It was the beginning of a tradition. Someone got drunk, survived it, and decided to do it again on purpose, and thus the world's first hangover arrived. The next morning, our ancient innovator woke up in a puddle of their own choices, dehydrated, dizzy, and inventing the first known excuse. It must have been something I ate. This wasn't just a drink. It was humanity's first coping mechanism, a portable vacation from reality, long before there were jobs, taxes, or neighbours to blame. So, yes, while later civilizations would build pyramids, write laws, and split atoms, this is where it truly began. One forgotten jar, one bad decision, and one species realizing that sometimes oblivion tastes pretty good. If you ever needed proof that humans have their priorities backward, look no further than Mesopotamia. Around 4000 BCE, while the rest of nature was evolving for survival, humanity invented beer, and only afterward thought, "You know what might go well with this? Food." Yes, beer came before bread. People were brewing barley long before they figured out how to bake it. Archaeologists found ancient tablets showing Sumerians joyfully drinking from large communal pots through straws, because even then, nobody wanted to share germs. These weren't small cups either. Imagine a group of adults hunched over what looks like a muddy punch bowl, sipping in silence and pretending it's a spiritual experience. That was civilization's first happy hour. The Sumerians didn't just drink beer. They built an entire belief system around it. They had a goddess of brewing named Ninkasi, because of course they did. Her hymn, yes, there's a hymn, doubles as a recipe for beer. It's probably the oldest surviving homebrew guide on Earth. Modern civilization began not with philosophy, but with a tipsy choir praising a divine bartender. Beer wasn't a luxury, it was essential infrastructure. Water in ancient Mesopotamia wasn't exactly safe. It was more of a health gamble. But beer, brewed and fermented, was purified by boiling and alcohol content. In other words, drinking beer wasn't irresponsible. It was the healthiest choice available. Imagine explaining that to your doctor today. Daily rations included beer for everyone. Workers, priests, even children. And it wasn't the fizzy golden stuff we know now. It was thick, sweet, and full of floating barley bits. Archaeologists describe it as nutrient-rich. Modern translation, drinkable oatmeal with a buzz. And yet, somehow, this murky brew fueled the world's first cities. People farmed, built temples, and wrote cuneiform tablets, all while maintaining a steady state of mild intoxication. Which explains why half of early Sumerian laws sound like they were written at closing time. So yes, beer built civilization. Not logic, not language, not ambition. Just a group of dehydrated farmers, solving the world's problems one foamy bowl at a time. If Mesopotamia invented beer, Egypt turned it into a lifestyle. By 3000 BCE, the Nile Valley had mastered the art of getting tipsy before lunch. Beer wasn't a treat, it was daily nutrition. It appeared at breakfast, prayer, wages, and funerals. Technically, you could live your entire life fueled by bread, onions, and beer, which explains why most ancient Egyptians looked both busy and perpetually tired. For the common people, beer was cheap and thick, more of a liquid porridge than a drink. It was brewed from barley and emmer wheat, sweetened with dates, and poured into clay jugs that probably hadn't been cleaned since the reign of the last guy. Still, it was safer than Nile water, which came with bonus parasites. The average peasant drank 2 to 3 litres a day, which means half of Egyptian civilization was built by people who were quietly buzzed. Even children drank it. Not because ancient Egypt was wild, but because sober hydration wasn't an option. When the water gives you dysentery, beer for breakfast starts to sound perfectly reasonable. Parents would fill clay cups for their kids and send them off to school like it was orange juice. And we wonder why math was invented elsewhere. The upper class, meanwhile, preferred wine, the official beverage of people who didn't do manual labour. Pharaohs imported it from Syria and Greece, stored it in ornate jars, and pretended it was a symbol of refinement instead of grape juice gone rogue. Cleopatra herself supposedly had her own vineyard, because ruling Egypt apparently required both charm and Cabernet. Temples brewed on an industrial scale. Workers who built the pyramids were paid in daily rations of bread and beer, meaning the most iconic monument on Earth was fueled by carbohydrates and mild inebriation. The afterlife even came stocked with it. Tomb paintings show servants pouring beer for the dead, ensuring eternal refreshment, and, presumably, eternal hangovers. So while Egypt gave us papyrus geometry and divine kingship, it also gave us something more relatable. The eternal truth that life is easier to endure when it's slightly blurry around the edges. While the Egyptians were drinking bread soup and calling it beer, the Chinese were doing something far more refined, or at least pretending to. Around 3000 BCE, early brewers in the Yellow River Valley began fermenting rice, millet, and fruit into beverages that actually tasted intentional. Archaeologists have found ornate bronze vessels coated in residue that once held early Chinese wine, proof that humanity's talent for turning dinner into liquid regret was now a global phenomenon. Unlike other cultures that stumbled into intoxication, the Chinese organized it. Fermentation wasn't a happy accident, it was chemistry with religious backing. Alcohol was considered a gift from the heavens, a bridge between mortals and their ancestors. Which is poetic until you remember that this bridge usually ended with someone singing off-key before passing out in a rice field. Drinking became central to ritual life. Kings and nobles hosted elaborate ceremonies where wine was offered to the spirits, and then immediately to themselves, just to make sure it was safe. Ancient texts mention officials who lost their positions for being too sober at court banquets. In other words, abstaining wasn't just uncool, it was politically risky. The Chinese didn't brew casually, they engineered it. They refined fermentation vessels, standardized recipes, and even documented alcohol etiquette. By the Shang dynasty, around 1600 BCE, court life was one long, well-funded tasting session. There were official drinking songs, drinking cups shaped like animals, and, inevitably, the first government warnings about excess. Because even the world's oldest bureaucracy realised that productivity plummets when half your ministers are horizontal. Still, alcohol was seen as sacred, the water of life, as early poets called it. It inspired calligraphy, music, and the kind of philosophy that only makes sense until you reread it sober. Even Confucius, the future champion of discipline, warned against drunkenness, with the kind of weary tone that suggests personal experience. So while other civilizations were still figuring out how to keep their beer from exploding, the Chinese were already holding formal banquets, toasting their ancestors, and probably forgetting half their toasts by dessert. Civilization, it seems, doesn't truly begin until someone's offering spiritual enlightenment with a side of fermented fruit. If there's one thing that unites all early civilizations, it's their determination to make sure someone was drinking during the invention of writing. In Mesopotamia, around 2700 BCE, alcohol wasn't just a beverage, it was a plot device. The world's oldest known story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, reads like an ancient cautionary tale about friendship, mortality, and drinking outside your comfort zone. The story introduces Enkidu, a wild man who lives among animals until a woman lures him into civilization with two very convincing arguments: bread and beer. After his first drink, Enkidu became human, which is a polite way of saying he discovered the magic of lowered standards. The Sumerians didn't believe alcohol corrupted man. They believed it completed him. Somewhere, a modern philosopher is still trying to argue that point with less evidence. In Mesopotamia, beer wasn't just social, it was spiritual. Temples doubled as breweries, priests moonlighted as bartenders, and offerings to the gods often included a fresh pint. Archaeologists have found clay tablets featuring ancient recipes, literal hymns to Ninkasi, the goddess of beer. They read less like scripture and more like a medieval pub song. Praise the brew, stir the mash, and may your liver hold out another year. Beer was considered liquid bread, a phrase that made fasting sound virtuous and happy hour sound holy. It was also practical, a way to preserve grain without it rotting. Workers building temples and canals received daily beer rations as wages. Somewhere between the fifth and sixth sip, civilization started to make sense, writing contracts, dividing labour, and occasionally passing out beside the ziggurat. The result? History's first bureaucracy fueled by barley. Accountants recorded beer rations, priests blessed the barrels, and poets immortalised the feeling of a good buzz. Ancient tablets even include complaints from workers about receiving weak beer. That's right. The world's first customer service feedback was a 4,000-year-old Yelp review about watered-down ale. So while philosophers would later debate the meaning of life, Mesopotamia had already found it. At the bottom of a communal beer pot, humanity's first epic didn't just celebrate heroism. It celebrated the universal truth that no great story ever started with a salad. If Mesopotamia drank for civilization and Egypt drank for religion, the Greeks drank for conversation, and sometimes to forget the conversation they just had. By 600 BCE, Greece had elevated alcohol from mere refreshment to a full-blown social institution. The symposium, a word that literally means drinking together, which, to be fair, is still a cornerstone of Western philosophy. A symposium wasn't a tavern or a frat party, though the line was thin. It was a structured drinking event with rules, music, poetry, and at least one person pretending to be profound. The guests reclined on couches, servants poured wine, and everyone discussed ethics until ethics stopped mattering. They even appointed a symposiarch, the designated adult whose job was to water down the wine, because Greek wine was so strong it could make a Spartan hug someone. And yes, they always watered it down. Mixing wine with water was the mark of civilization. Drinking it straight was considered barbaric, something Thracians did before invading your city. The Greeks genuinely believed that moderation separated man from beast, which is ironic, considering the average symposium ended with someone crying, singing, or waking up next to a broken lyre. The gods, of course, had their own drinking scene. Dionysus, god of wine and chaos, was the divine patron of both theatre and hangovers. His followers roamed the countryside, dancing, shouting, and making modern music festivals look like knitting clubs. To the Greeks, intoxication wasn't just indulgence, it was temporary madness blessed by heaven. Philosophers weren't immune either. Plato, in his dialogue Symposium, used drinking as a metaphor for love and divine truth, because apparently nothing says eternal wisdom like slurred metaphysics. One can imagine Socrates, cup in hand, insisting that virtue is knowledge, while everyone else debated whose cup that was. The Greeks did, however, give the world its first recorded hangover cure, eating cabbage before drinking. It didn't work, but it did confirm humanity's eternal optimism in the face of bad decisions. So yes, the Greeks mixed logic with wine, reason with chaos, and gave birth to Western philosophy between refills. Civilization had discovered something crucial. Deep thought is always easier when you can blame it on the alcohol. Every civilization has its party god, but the Greeks outdid everyone with Dionysus, the divine embodiment of wine, ecstasy, and poor impulse control. While other deities handed down moral codes or laws, Dionysus showed up barefoot with a bottle and said, "Let's feel something." His cult spread like spilled wine across the Mediterranean. Followers, mostly women called maenads, abandoned their homes to join wild processions into the mountains. There, under the influence of fermented grape juice and divine enthusiasm, they sang, danced, and occasionally tore apart small animals, the ancient equivalent of festival chaos, but make it religious. To outsiders, this looked insane. To believers, it was transcendence. The Greeks saw drunkenness not as sin, but as a divine state, temporary madness that stripped away logic and let mortals glimpse the gods. In short, Dionysus was history's first spiritual excuse for bad decisions. His festivals, the Dionysia, were wild, joyful, and mandatory. They started as wine-soaked parades and ended up inventing theatre. Yes, Western drama literally began as a drinking festival. Tragedy and comedy were born in the same place. Someone once shouted, "Who drank all the amphorae?" Actors wore masks, choruses sang hymns, and playwrights competed for prizes, all while the audience maintained a polite level of intoxication that modern critics would call immersive participation. But Dionysus wasn't all party. His myths warned that rejecting joy was dangerous. King Pentheus tried to ban his cult, calling it indecent, which ended poorly when the maenads, in a frenzy, mistook him for a lion and solved the problem violently. Moral of the story: never get between a Greek and their weekend plans. For the philosophers, Dionysus represented the chaos inside the human soul, the opposite of Apollo, god of order. Together, they symbolized the eternal tension between reason and instinct. Or, to put it less academically, the voice that says, "Be responsible," and the other that says, "One more won't hurt." In Dionysus, the Greeks found both creation and destruction, the bliss of losing control and the hangover that follows enlightenment. Civilization needed both gods, after all. Without Apollo, we'd have no structure. Without Dionysus, we'd have no stories worth telling. When it came to alcohol, the Romans didn't just drink. They industrialized it. If the Greeks drank for philosophy, the Romans drank for everything else: politics, religion, hygiene, and boredom. They had a saying, "In vino veritas," in wine there is truth, which probably explains why so many Roman truths ended with bad decisions and new emperors. Wine was the fuel of the empire. It flowed through aqueducts of social life, from the slums to the Senate. Everyone drank it: soldiers, farmers, slaves, emperors, even the gods in myth. It was so essential that soldiers received daily wine rations instead of water, which raises a few questions about Roman military strategy. Marching hundreds of miles through Gaul while mildly buzzed? Bold move, Caesar. Roman vineyards stretched across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. They cultivated hundreds of varieties, none of which were aged, filtered, or remotely pleasant. Ancient wine was syrupy, acidic, and often mixed with honey, herbs, seawater, or anything that might distract from the taste. Think less fine vintage, more liquid dare. At feasts, guests reclined on couches, surrounded by silver cups and regret. Servants poured endlessly while musicians played, and philosophers shouted half-coherent Latin about virtue. Drinking wasn't about taste, it was about status. The richer the Roman, the more bizarre the ingredients. Caligula supposedly mixed pearls into his wine to prove his wealth, or perhaps to explain why everyone looked terrified at dinner. Of course, there were attempts at moderation. The Stoics warned against excess, claiming self-control was the path to wisdom. But the Stoics were also the same people who lived under Nero, so one can forgive them for occasionally breaking their own rules. Public drunkenness wasn't condemned, it was expected. Poets wrote verses about hangovers, and even the gods drank heavily. Bacchus, the Roman version of Dionysus, had his own festivals so chaotic that the Senate eventually banned them. Naturally, that made them twice as popular. Rome built roads, aqueducts, and empires. But its true legacy might be social drinking. When the empire finally fell, it wasn't just to barbarians or politics. It was, at least partly, to the eternal Roman habit of raising a glass and saying, "We'll deal with it tomorrow." While the Greeks philosophized over wine and the Romans drowned in it, the Persians turned drinking into literature. They treated wine the way most people treat religion, with devotion, ritual, and the occasional public scandal. In ancient Achaemenid Persia, kings hosted banquets that could feed a small city. Herodotus claimed guests were expected to get drunk and then make important decisions, because, according to Persian logic, a plan tested while sober and intoxicated had double the integrity. A system that probably worked until someone suggested invading Greece after dessert. But the real poetry of wine came centuries later, under the Islamic Golden Age, when alcohol became a theological controversy with a side of irony. The Quran banned it, yet Persian poets couldn't stop writing about it. They called it the forbidden nectar, the ruby of the soul, liquid wisdom. Basically, the world's first creative loophole. No one mastered the art of poetic intoxication quite like Omar Khayyam, the 11th century astronomer, mathematician, and wine enthusiast who turned hangovers into haikus. His Rubaiyat reads like a soft rebellion, verses dripping with nostalgia, philosophy, and subtle blasphemy. "A jug of wine, a loaf of bread, and thou," he wrote, which is ancient Persian for date night under house arrest. In truth, Persian society had a complex relationship with the bottle. Publicly, wine was sinful. Privately, it was practically an art form. Aristocrats drank in lush gardens surrounded by fountains, poetry, and plausible deniability. They toasted to love, beauty, and occasionally the hypocrisy of their own laws. It was the kind of cultural tension only a civilization both brilliant and deeply self-aware could sustain. Persian physicians even prescribed wine for health, diluted, of course, to strengthen the spirit and improve digestion. So yes, even medieval doctors were giving out excuses. By the time travellers from Europe arrived, they were shocked to find that Persians, officially dry, were quietly running some of the most refined wineries in the world. The Persian relationship with alcohol was a balancing act. One hand writing scripture, the other uncorking metaphor. They didn't just drink to forget. They drank to remember beautifully. While Rome sipped its spiced wine and recited poetry about empire, the so-called barbarians of northern Europe were doing something far more efficient, getting unapologetically drunk. The Celts, Germans, and Norse didn't care about etiquette, philosophy, or proper dilution ratios. They cared about results, namely, forgetting winter and improving their confidence in battle. The Greeks called them barbarians because they didn't mix their wine with water. The barbarians called the Greeks boring. Their preferred brews were mead and ale, both of which came in quantities that could drown a small child. Mead, fermented honey and water, was the drink of heroes, kings, and anyone who could stand upright long enough to refill their horn. The Vikings believed mead came from the gods themselves, specifically from a mythical vat filled with honey and poetry. The fact that this beverage inspired both war songs and spontaneous axe-throwing contests says a lot about its effectiveness. The Celts had their own beer, brewed in clay pots and flavoured with herbs instead of hops. They drank it from communal bowls, shouting toasts that probably sounded inspiring at the time and incoherent the next morning. In Celtic culture, hospitality meant refilling your guest's cup until they achieved spiritual enlightenment, or passed out. Meanwhile, the Germans developed ale so strong that even Roman diplomats mentioned it with caution. When Tacitus wrote about German tribes, he described them as fierce, brave, and fond of drunken councils, which is ancient Latin for, they keep making military plans they can't remember. But drinking wasn't just recreation, it was ritual. To the northern tribes, alcohol connected them to their ancestors and gods. Warriors drank before raids to gain courage, and after battle to forget what they'd done with it. Mead was sacred at funerals, weddings, and every occasion that could be made slightly louder. When Rome finally fell, it wasn't the barbarians drinking that shocked them. It was the realization that these uncivilized people had been celebrating life the whole time. Where Rome had laws, they had toasts. Where Rome had rhetoric, they had rhythm. In the end, the so-called barbarians didn't just conquer the empire, they outdrank it. And that, in its own way, might be history's most intoxicating victory. When the Roman Empire collapsed, it left behind three things: bad roads, suspicious water, and an enormous collective hangover. Into that chaos stepped a new kind of hero, the monk. They didn't wear armour, wield swords, or chase glory. They brewed beer. Yes, while barbarians were busy inventing kingdoms and plundering libraries, monks quietly perfected the art of fermentation. In cold, draughty monasteries from France to Bavaria, they discovered that beer could be more than survival fluid. It could be holy hydration. During fasting, when food was forbidden but liquids were allowed, monks brewed a thick, nourishing beer they nicknamed liquid bread. It was practical theology. Obey God, stay hydrated, and feel pleasantly detached from earthly suffering. Medieval monastic beer wasn't the light golden brew we know today. It was dense, cloudy, and packed with calories. More a meal you could pour than a drink you could chug. Monks refined recipes, experimented with yeasts, and standardized brewing temperatures centuries before craft beer became a personality trait. Some even kept brewing logs more detailed than royal chronicles, because priorities. Every monastery had its own style. The Benedictines favoured malty sweetness, the Cistercians aimed for purity, and the Trappists perfected patience, the virtue most useful when your entire existence revolves around waiting for fermentation. Beer wasn't just sustenance, it was an economic engine. Monks sold it to pilgrims, travellers, and anyone desperate to forget feudalism for an evening. The church tolerated this because, frankly, it worked. Beer was safer than water and kept the populace content. A mildly intoxicated peasantry was a peaceful one. And since monasteries controlled production, holiness stayed comfortably profitable. Some historians credit these monks with saving beer itself. Without their careful record-keeping, brewing might have vanished alongside Roman plumbing and dental hygiene. Instead, they turned it into a science. Today, when you crack open a Belgian ale, you're tasting the legacy of men who took vows of silence, and then invented a drink that made silence enjoyable. So while knights won glory and kings claimed crowns, monks won something more enduring: the eternal gratitude of anyone who's ever needed to make medieval life a little more bearable. While monks were brewing salvation one barrel at a time, everyone else in medieval Europe was simply trying to stay cheerful, or at least hydrated. Enter mead, the golden honey-based ancestor of all comfort drinks. Before hops became fashionable, mead was the sweet, sticky drink of choice for kings, peasants, and anyone who needed to forget the weather for a few hours. Mead had ancient roots but found its true calling in the Dark Ages, when it shone like liquid sunlight in a world of mud and superstition. It was easy to make, just honey, water, and a bit of reckless optimism. Fermentation did the rest. In northern Europe, where grapes refused to grow, and barley froze half the year, mead became the closest thing to happiness in a cup. The Norsemen treated it as divine. According to legend, the gods themselves drank from the mead of poetry, a celestial brew that granted wisdom, eloquence, and occasionally terrible singing. Viking skalds composed verses about it, which might explain why half their poetry reads like a drunk text carved into stone. A proper Viking feast wasn't measured by food, but by how many horns of mead you could survive before declaring eternal brotherhood with the furniture. Further south, mead became the wedding drink of choice. Newlyweds were given enough honey wine to last a moon's cycle, hence the term honeymoon, a romantic tradition that originally involved two people and one very long hangover. Peasants, meanwhile, made simpler versions with whatever honey they could find, sometimes spiced with herbs, sometimes with bugs. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. After a day of field labour, a warm mug of mead could turn even feudalism into mild comedy. Monks brewed it too, because monks brewed everything. They used mead in medicine, in cooking, and, presumably, in diplomacy. It was sweet, shelf-stable, and easier to bless than wine. By the 13th century, mead began losing ground to beer and wine, but it never quite disappeared. It lingered, the quiet golden ghost of Europe's drinking past, a drink born of bees and boredom, reminding everyone that sometimes history doesn't advance. It just refills the cup. As medieval Europe perfected the art of drinking responsibly, never, the Islamic world was moving in the opposite direction, at least on paper. When Islam spread across the Middle East in the 7th century, it brought a clear message. Alcohol was haram, forbidden. In theory, that should have ended centuries of intoxication. In practice, it turned drinking into one of history's longest-running winks. Before Islam, the Arabian Peninsula already knew its liquors. The Bedouins brewed date wine, Persians loved their poetry and pomegranate cocktails, and everyone agreed that hangovers were universal. Then came the Prophet Muhammad, who outlawed alcohol not out of spite, but survival. Drunken camel races were ending poorly, and someone had to be the adult in the room. The early caliphs enforced sobriety with admirable effort, but the empire grew faster than its rules. From Spain to Persia, local customs proved resilient. Court poets kept writing suspiciously passionate odes to wine, which, they insisted, was a metaphor for divine love. Of course, that divine love also made you hiccup, sing, and confess things to total strangers. Nowhere was the contradiction more delicious than in Baghdad. By the 9th century, it was the centre of art, science, and polite disobedience. The Abbasid caliphs officially banned wine, but kept private gardens where fountains didn't always flow with water. The poet Abu Nuwas, Baghdad's most charming menace, filled entire volumes with verses about drinking under moonlight, lines so beautiful that religious scholars spent centuries arguing whether he was being spiritual or sarcastic. Meanwhile, physicians prescribed wine for digestive harmony, Sufis used intoxication as a metaphor for mystical union, and merchants quietly traded grapes behind mosques. The official stance was sobriety, the unofficial one was curiosity. By the 12th century, Islamic chemists had even refined distillation, producing early forms of spirits, though they mostly called it medicine to avoid awkward questions. Ironically, the word alcohol itself comes from Arabic, al-kul, meaning the essence. The language that banned it also gave it a name. So yes, the Islamic world went dry, officially. Unofficially, it just learned to pour its rebellion into verse. By the 13th century, Europe had finally sobered up just enough to invent the tavern, a public house where everyone could drink together, argue about taxes, and forget they were peasants for a few glorious hours. It was democracy before democracy, only louder and slightly stickier. Taverns became the social engine of medieval life. Lords had castles, priests had cathedrals, but ordinary people had the pub. You didn't need wealth or pedigree to enter, just a thirst and enough coins to make it past the door. Inside, the floor was straw, The air was smoke, and the rules were simple. Drink, sing, and pretend your problems were the king's fault. They popped up everywhere, along trade routes, near markets, beside churches, because convenience matters. For travellers, taverns were lifesavers. For locals, they were therapy with a handle. It was the one place where a blacksmith could debate theology with a monk, a farmer could complain about rent to a knight, and everyone could agree the ale tasted better last week. Alewives, women who brewed and sold beer, ran many of these establishments. They were entrepreneurial, fierce, and often accused of witchcraft, mostly because their success made men uncomfortable. Their trade signs, broomsticks, cats, and cauldrons, later inspired much of the witch imagery we know today. So yes, medieval feminism smelled faintly of hops. Taverns also became the birthplace of politics. Revolution doesn't start in palaces. It starts wherever someone's shouting, "You know what we should do," over a third mug of ale. From the peasant uprisings of England to the conspiracies that shaped Renaissance Italy, history's boldest ideas often began in places with questionable sanitation. Authorities hated taverns for exactly that reason. Kings feared sedition, priests feared sin, and innkeepers feared running out of beer. Still, taverns survived every crackdown, because shutting down drinking in the Middle Ages was like banning rain. It just moved locations. By the end of the 15th century, taverns weren't just hangouts. They were culture. They gave Europe its gossip, its folk songs, its revolutions, and perhaps most importantly, its first public bathrooms, of sorts. Civilization had finally created a place where everyone could gather, disagree, and stumble home together. By the late Middle Ages, Europe had spent the better part of a millennium drinking its way through disease, famine, and theology. When the Renaissance arrived, everyone simply traded mead for wine and called it progress. The new age of reason was, ironically, soaked in alcohol. Scholars debated astronomy, anatomy, and metaphysics, usually over a jug of something fermented. Da Vinci drank in moderation, Michelangelo preferred wine to water, and Erasmus joked that no one could think clearly on an empty stomach or a dry throat. Civilization was sobering up intellectually, not physically. The printing press spread knowledge, but taverns spread opinions faster. Coffee houses hadn't arrived yet, so beer remained Europe's unofficial Wi-Fi. It connected merchants, artists, sailors, and anyone who could still afford a cup. New beverages were appearing too. Distilled spirits from alchemists' labs, sweet wines from the Mediterranean, and early tonics that claimed to cure everything except hangovers. The age of exploration also became the age of exporting alcoholism. European ships carried wine, rum, and brandy to every corner of the known world, ensuring that no civilization would ever again suffer the tragedy of sobriety. Colonial merchants made fortunes on sugar and spirits, and sailors drank enough rum to keep scurvy away, or at least not care about it. At home, drinking became social performance. Royal banquets featured fountains that flowed with wine, because nothing says divine right like sticky floors. Henry VIII brewed his own ale, proving you can dismantle a church and still be very committed to homebrewing. Meanwhile, peasants continued their eternal tradition, drinking the same weak ale and pretending not to notice that nothing had changed. By the 17th century, Europe stood on the edge of modernity, with printing, science, and political reform, but still firmly clutching its mug. The church had doctrines, the universities had logic, and the taverns had better attendance. It's tempting to think of alcohol as a side note to history, but it's closer to the soundtrack. From ancient rice brews to Renaissance vineyards, the story of civilization isn't just about invention, it's about endurance. And humanity, ever resourceful, found that a little fermentation made endurance taste a lot better. The year was 41 BCE. Rome stood fractured, its triumvirs uneasy allies after the assassination of Julius Caesar. Mark Antony, the brilliant but impulsive general, had been sent east to restore order and secure loyalty among Rome's provinces. Yet beyond politics awaited a woman who could alter the course of empires, Cleopatra VII, Queen of Egypt. Antony summoned her to the city of Tarsus to answer charges that she had aided Caesar's enemies. It was a power play, Rome reminding Egypt who ruled the Mediterranean. But Cleopatra had no intention of appearing as a supplicant. Instead, she arrived as a goddess. Her barge sailed up the Cydnus River, draped in purple sails that caught the sun like molten gold. Perfume wafted across the water, and musicians played as attendants fanned her throne. She reclined beneath a canopy of gold cloth, dressed as Isis incarnate, the goddess of fertility and power. When Antony finally laid eyes on her, the balance of power shifted. He had faced legions, conspiracies, and kings, but never a woman who could command silence with a glance. Cleopatra understood performance better than any ruler of her age. She knew that perception was power, and she crafted her entrance as carefully as Rome forged its swords. Antony, both soldier and sensualist, found himself enthralled. The two dined together that night in a spectacle that outshone any Roman triumph. Banquets of roasted peacocks, jewelled goblets brimming with wine, and laughter that lingered until dawn. Yet beneath the silken gold was strategy. Cleopatra's throne was precarious. Egypt depended on Rome's favour for survival. Aligning with Antony could secure her kingdom's future and her son Caesarion's claim as the heir of Julius Caesar. Antony, meanwhile, saw in her not only a lover, but an ally of immense wealth and mystique. Egypt's riches could fuel his ambitions against his rival, Octavian, back in Rome. That night, two worlds collided. The disciplined steel of Roman authority and the perfumed splendour of Egyptian divinity. Their meeting was more than passion. It was politics wrapped in seduction, empire disguised as romance. And from that first encounter, neither would ever rule or love the same way again. In the weeks that followed, Mark Antony remained in Cleopatra's orbit, first as a guest, then as something far more intimate. Their alliance grew not merely from desire, but from shared ambition. Antony saw in Cleopatra the embodiment of everything Rome had lost: grandeur without restraint, wealth without guilt, beauty entwined with power. Cleopatra, in turn, saw in him the instrument of her political survival, a man who could restore Egypt's influence in the Mediterranean and secure her son's future. Antony was captivated by the queen's intellect as much as her allure. Cleopatra was fluent in multiple languages, quick with wit, and utterly fearless in debate. She could discuss philosophy with the same ease that she ordered fleets into the Nile. Unlike Roman women, who were bound by decorum, Cleopatra ruled with unashamed sovereignty. To Antony, who had spent years under the shadow of Caesar and the scrutiny of Rome's Senate, her presence was intoxicating. She offered him what the Republic never could: freedom from politics disguised as duty. Their days were spent in lavish feasts, philosophical conversations, and carefully staged games. Together they formed the Inimitable Livers, a private society devoted to excess, luxury, and laughter. They disguised themselves at night, wandering Alexandria's streets in playful anonymity, drinking with sailors, mocking magistrates, and living like mortals instead of monarchs. The city adored them. Cleopatra's charisma turned every appearance into theatre, and Antony's rough charm complemented her perfectly. But while they revelled, the world beyond their golden walls was changing. In Rome, Octavian, Julius Caesar's adopted son, watched Antony's behaviour with growing suspicion. Every rumour of debauchery, every tale of Egyptian splendour, reached his ears and stoked his resentment. To Octavian, Antony was no longer a Roman hero, but a man seduced by an Eastern temptress, one who threatened the unity of the Republic itself. Still, Antony dismissed such whispers as envy. He believed his military prowess, and his name could withstand any scandal. Cleopatra encouraged his confidence, gifting him ships, silver, and soldiers to secure his campaigns. Together, they forged not only a romance, but a partnership meant to rival Rome's might. In Alexandria, they were king and queen of pleasure and power alike, two rulers in love, defying the empire that sought to divide them. But Rome, jealous and unrelenting, was already sharpening its knives. By the time Antony returned to Alexandria in 37 BCE, his bond with Cleopatra had evolved from indulgence to calculated alliance. The queen had proven herself indispensable. Egypt's treasury overflowed with grain, gold, and the fabled Nile wealth that Rome's legions could never fully plunder. For Antony, who dreamed of surpassing Caesar's glory and ruling the Eastern world, Cleopatra was both muse and means. She welcomed him with the splendor of a pharaoh. Banquets glittered beneath ceilings of silver stars, and dancers reenacted the divine union of Isis and Osiris, symbolizing their own partnership. Cleopatra presented Antony with gifts not of love, but of empire, ships for his campaigns, soldiers trained in Egyptian archery, and the loyalty of the eastern provinces. In return, Antony granted her territories, Cyprus, Crete, parts of Syria and Cilicia, restoring much of Egypt's former Ptolemaic domain. It was a gesture that infuriated Rome, which saw its general carving away pieces of the Republic for a foreign queen. To their followers, however, Antony and Cleopatra appeared as divine counterparts, he as the new Dionysus, god of wine and conquest, she as Isis, the mother of kings. Together, they styled themselves rulers of the East, openly embracing the grandeur of monarchy that Rome pretended to despise but secretly envied. Antony's Roman discipline softened. He dressed in Eastern robes, adopted Egyptian rituals, and held court in the lavish palace overlooking the Nile. Cleopatra bore him twins, a boy and a girl named Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, symbols of their union's divine legitimacy. Their births were celebrated as omens of a new dynasty that would unite East and West. Cleopatra saw in her children not just heirs, but living proof that her bloodline could outlast Rome's. Yet not everyone rejoiced. In the marble halls of the Senate, whispers turned to outrage. Antony's distribution of kingdoms to Cleopatra's children, the so-called donations of Alexandria, was viewed as treason. To the Romans, he was no longer a protector of their interests, but a man bewitched, handing the world's riches to an Egyptian seductress. In their palace, the lovers toasted to eternity beneath the fragrance of lotus and myrrh. But beyond the Nile, storm clouds gathered. Octavian's propaganda began to paint them as enemies of Roman virtue, a decadent queen and a fallen hero, daring to dream of empire in defiance of the Republic. As the years passed, Antony and Cleopatra built a world that seemed to float between myth and power, a realm of pleasure gilded by ambition. Alexandria became the beating heart of their empire, where politics was conducted in marble halls perfumed with incense, and feasts became councils of strategy. The queen's court shimmered with philosophers, engineers, and poets, each serving her vision of an Egypt reborn under divine rule. Antony, the hardened general who once commanded Rome's armies, found himself transformed. No longer bound by the Senate's scorn, he revelled in the Egyptian ideal of kingship, a god among men. He trained his legions by day and feasted by night, hosting spectacles that blurred the line between politics and performance. Cleopatra joined him in armour on parade, presenting herself as Isis beside her consort Dionysus. Together, they appeared before the crowds on golden thrones, uniting Roman strength and Egyptian divinity in a single image of unchallengeable majesty. Yet behind the music and the opulence, their empire teetered on peril. Antony's campaigns against Parthia, the eastern rival of Rome, ended in humiliation. The desert devoured his army, his legions starving and frostbitten, retreating through mountains littered with corpses. It was a disaster Rome would not forgive. Cleopatra, ever pragmatic, met him upon his return not with reproach, but with comfort. She financed the rebuilding of his forces, replenished his coffers, and restored his pride. Their alliance, once romantic, was now bound by necessity and survival. Still, their enemies were multiplying. Octavian, watching from Rome, seized upon Antony's failures, and wove them into scandal. He claimed Antony had abandoned his Roman wife, Octavia, Octavian's own sister, for the Egyptian queen. Rumours spread that Antony planned to move the capital from Rome to Alexandria and declare Cleopatra's son Caesarion the rightful heir of Julius Caesar. In Alexandria, the lovers dismissed such talk with laughter, yet the laughter grew strained. The world beyond their palace was no longer dazzled by their legend. To many Romans, Cleopatra was no longer a queen, but a threat, a foreign sorceress who had ensnared their general and corrupted him with Eastern decadence. Still, for a brief, luminous moment, they ruled as gods in a mortal world, while Rome, restless and vengeful, prepared to strike. By 33 BCE, the illusion of peace between Antony and Octavian had shattered completely. Their alliance, once bound by the memory of Julius Caesar, crumbled under jealousy, ambition, and fear. Octavian, now the political master of Rome, moved swiftly to turn the Republic against Antony and Cleopatra. He weaponized rumour with precision, transforming their romance into scandal, their grandeur into treason. He circulated tales of Cleopatra's sorcery, claiming she had bewitched Antony with foreign magic and reduced him to her puppet. Statues of the once great general were mocked in the streets, dressed in silk and gold to resemble an Eastern despot. Pamphlets accused him of giving away Roman provinces to Cleopatra's children and plotting to crown himself and her as rulers of the world. Octavian presented himself as Rome's saviour, promising to free the Republic from the enslavement of a queen. The Senate, hungry for an enemy to unite them, followed his lead. Antony, for his part, refused to bow. He still commanded vast armies in the east and the loyalty of seasoned legions who had fought beside him for years. But the damage to his reputation was done. In speeches and letters, Octavian painted him as a traitor who had traded Roman virtue for Egyptian decadence. Even Antony's friends in the Senate began to withdraw, fearful of sharing his fate. Cleopatra understood propaganda as well as any Roman. She urged Antony to act decisively, to strike before Octavian could consolidate his power. But Antony hesitated, torn between two worlds. The disciplined general Rome had made him and the god-king Egypt had turned him into. Their love, once their greatest strength, now divided him. Cleopatra's counsel was bold, but it came from the perspective of a monarch, not a statesman. She fought for dynasty, he fought for dignity. In 32 BCE, Octavian took the final step. He declared war, not on Antony directly, but on Cleopatra. It was a masterstroke. By making the Egyptian queen the enemy, he framed the conflict as one of civilization versus corruption. Rome would march not against one of its own, but against a foreign queen who had dared to seduce a Roman hero, and thus love itself became the battlefield. The lovers would stand together, knowing that to fight for one another now meant to fight against the greatest empire the world had ever known. As war loomed, Antony and Cleopatra gathered their forces in Greece. The year was 31 BCE, and the air was thick with tension and prophecy. Their combined armies were vast, hundreds of warships, tens of thousands of soldiers, and enough gold to fund a decade of conflict. Yet beneath the glitter of banners and bronze, unease lingered. The soldiers were loyal, but the cause was muddled. Were they fighting for Antony's honour, or for Cleopatra's crown? For Rome, or for love? Antony established his headquarters at Patrae, while Cleopatra arrived with her fleet, magnificent galleys adorned with purple sails and gilded prows. Her presence divided his officers. To some she was a symbol of divine fortune, to others a distraction that eroded Roman discipline. Commanders whispered that Antony had surrendered strategy to passion. Yet Cleopatra brought more than beauty. She brought money, provisions, and a fleet trained on the Nile, disciplined and fierce. Without her, Antony's campaign would have starved before it began. Their enemies, led by Octavian and his brilliant Admiral Agrippa, advanced methodically. Agrippa seized key ports along the western coast, cutting Antony's supply lines and isolating his fleet. Antony's officers urged him to fight on land, where his legions held the advantage. But Cleopatra, wary of another desert disaster, insisted on a naval battle. She believed her fleet's size and the favourable winds of the Ionian Sea would turn the tide. Antony, ever torn between love and logic, agreed. The lovers spent their final days before battle together in a tense stillness, half strategy, half farewell. Cleopatra tried to mask her fear behind regal poise, while Antony, weary and uncertain, sought omens that refused to favour him. The priest's readings were grim, the stars indifferent. When dawn broke over the Gulf of Actium, the sea shimmered like a mirror of fate. Antony's ships, massive but unwieldy, faced Octavian's smaller, more agile fleet. Cleopatra's flagship gleamed at the centre, a beacon of gold amid the mist. On shore, thousands of soldiers watched, waiting for victory, or for the end of everything they served. It was not merely a battle between two armies. It was the reckoning of two worlds, Roman order against Egyptian splendour, discipline against desire. And before the sun would set, love itself would be tested by fire and iron. On the 2nd of September, 31 BCE, the dawn over the Gulf of Actium glowed red, an omen the Egyptians read with dread. Cleopatra's fleet glittered with golden prows and purple sails, while Antony's warships formed a massive semicircle across the calm sea. On the opposite side, Octavian's Admiral Agrippa commanded leaner, faster vessels, perfectly suited for manoeuvre and discipline. The world's greatest powers faced each other across the water, and history itself seemed to hold its breath. The first clash came with the roar of rams striking hulls and the hiss of flaming arrows cutting the air. Antony's ships, though powerful, were heavy and slow. Agrippa's forces danced around them like hornets, burning sails and piercing decks. The chaos grew, smoke turning the bright day into a choking twilight. Amid the din, Cleopatra's flagship waited behind Antony's line, its golden canopy trembling with the wind. Then, at the height of confusion, Cleopatra made her move. Seeing the tide turning against them, or perhaps fearing capture, she raised her sails and steered south toward open water. Whether it was panic, strategy, or prearranged escape, no one can say. But Antony, upon seeing her banner retreat, abandoned command. He leapt into a small vessel and followed her, leaving his fleet leaderless. The sight of their commander fleeing shattered the morale of his men. Roman discipline crumbled into chaos. Ships burned, crews surrendered, and the sea became a graveyard of broken oars and corpses. Agrippa's fleet surged forward, crushing what remained. By nightfall, the battle was over. Rome had triumphed. When Antony finally reached Cleopatra's ship, the two met in silence. The victory banquets of Alexandria, the music, the laughter, all seemed like relics from another life. Their empire of love had turned to ash. Cleopatra tried to console him, but Antony's eyes were hollow. He had been a soldier all his life, and he knew what defeat meant: dishonour, exile, and the slow erasure of his name from history. Together, they sailed back to Egypt under a sky devoid of stars. The sea that had once carried their triumphs now bore only ruin. Actium had not merely ended a battle, it had broken the spell that had once bound love and empire together. When Antony and Cleopatra returned to Alexandria after Actium, their once mighty empire was a shadow of its former glory. The city that had once celebrated their splendour now trembled with uncertainty. The merchants whispered, the nobles watched, and the priests prayed. But all could feel it. Rome was coming. Still, within the marble halls of the palace, the lovers refused to yield to despair. Cleopatra filled the courts with music and incense, determined to maintain the illusion of power, even as the world collapsed around them. Antony, once the Lion of Rome, was broken. He rarely appeared in public, choosing instead to train what troops remained with grim determination. He still had the loyalty of a few thousand men, but his spirit was fading. Cleopatra tried to rekindle his strength, reminding him of his victories, of his name, of his legend, but Antony knew that Octavian's shadow stretched too far to escape. In his heart, he understood that their story was nearing its end. Cleopatra, however, was not done fighting. She began secret negotiations with Octavian, sending emissaries bearing gold and promises. Her message was simple. Egypt would surrender peacefully if her children and throne were spared. She hoped to save her dynasty, even if her love could not be saved. Octavian, cold and deliberate, listened. He admired her intellect, but distrusted her motives. To him, Cleopatra was not a queen, but a symbol, a serpent to be displayed, not reasoned with. Antony soon learned of these secret talks. Betrayal, or at least the illusion of it, cut him deeper than any sword. Rage turned to despair. Love turned to silence. The palace, once filled with laughter, now echoed only with footsteps and the distant sound of waves breaking against the harbour walls. Outside Alexandria, Octavian's legions marched closer, their banners glinting in the desert sun. The Nile Delta filled with the rumble of war machines and the scent of dust and iron. Cleopatra ordered her fleet burned to prevent its capture. Flames devoured the last symbol of their defiance, casting black smoke into the Egyptian sky. As night fell over Alexandria, Cleopatra stood upon her balcony and looked toward the west, toward Rome, toward destiny. She knew that her reign, her love, and perhaps even her life, would not see another sunrise. The final act was about to begin. By the summer of 30 BCE, the sands of Egypt had turned red with Rome's advance. Octavian's legions closed in on Alexandria from every direction, their banners gleaming beneath the relentless sun. Cleopatra's forces, outnumbered and demoralized, began to crumble. The city's gates, once the pride of the Ptolemies, now stood as mere symbols of defiance against the inevitable. Inside the palace, Cleopatra and Antony faced the end with the same intensity that had defined their love. Antony, haunted by failure and the loss of his honour, resolved to meet death as a Roman should. When false news reached him that Cleopatra had taken her own life, he fell upon his sword. As he bled out, servants rushed to tell him the truth, that the queen still lived. Mortally wounded, Antony demanded to be taken to her. They carried him to Cleopatra's hidden chamber, where she had taken refuge in her mausoleum, a glittering tomb she had built for herself long before defeat. As he was lifted through a window, bleeding and pale, Cleopatra held him in her arms. He died there, whispering her name, the last word of a soldier who had conquered half the world but been conquered by love. Octavian entered Alexandria soon after. He found Cleopatra in mourning but still regal, draped in gold and defiance. He promised her safety, intending to parade her in chains through the streets of Rome as a living trophy of his triumph. But Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, would not be humiliated. She prepared her final act as carefully as she had once prepared her entrance to Antony's court. On the 12th of August, she adorned herself in royal robes and seated herself upon her throne one last time. At her feet lay a basket of figs, harmless to the eye, deadly within. Concealed among them was the asp, the sacred serpent of Egypt, symbol of divine royalty and death. As it bit her, Cleopatra remained silent, her face serene. She died as she had lived, on her own terms, between history and myth. When Octavian found her lifeless body, he realized he had conquered a kingdom but lost a legend. With Cleopatra's death, the line of the pharaohs ended, and Egypt became a province of Rome. Yet her story, of love, power, and defiance, would echo through the centuries, eternal as the Nile itself. For a man who sought to conquer the world, Alexander the Great was undone not by swords, but by hearts. The son of Philip II and tutored by Aristotle, Alexander was raised to see power as destiny. Yet beneath the armour of the conqueror beat a heart far more unpredictable than any army he commanded. For all his victories on the battlefield, his greatest rebellions were often against tradition itself, and nowhere was that clearer than in his marriages. In 327 BCE, after years of relentless campaigning across Asia, Alexander met a woman who would defy every expectation of what a Macedonian queen should be. Her name was Roxana, a Bactrian princess, the daughter of Oxyates. The story goes that Alexander saw her for the first time at a feast in the mountain fortress of Sogdian Rock, shortly after his forces had captured it. She danced before him with a dagger in her hand, her movements fierce yet graceful, her eyes unflinching. To his generals, she was a captive. To Alexander, she was fire. What followed shocked his court. Instead of sending her to Macedonia as a trophy, or offering her as a political pawn, Alexander married her. No council, no negotiation, no alliance building, only love. His men grumbled that he had lost his mind, that the greatest conqueror alive had been conquered by a foreign girl. But Alexander didn't care. For perhaps the first time in his life, he acted purely from desire. The ceremony was held according to Persian custom, an act that outraged his Macedonian officers, who viewed it as yet another sign of Alexander's growing Eastern decadence. Yet to him, it was more than romance. It was symbolism. By marrying Roxana, he sought to unite East and West, to embody his dream of a single empire where cultures could blend rather than clash. Roxana, intelligent and proud, quickly adapted to her role. She was not the docile queen many expected. She was possessive, cunning, and deeply protective of her husband's legacy. Their union was both tender and dangerous, passion entwined with power, and though she bore him no heir during his lifetime, her hold on his heart was absolute. But Alexander's story, and scandal, was only beginning. Love may have chosen Roxana, but politics would soon demand far more. Roxana might have won Alexander's heart, but she quickly discovered she was not his only love. In his world, affection was not bound by gender or convention. For years, one name had followed Alexander across battlefields and into legend, Hephaestion. His companion since youth, his confidant in war, Hephaestion was more than a friend. To many, he was Alexander's other half, the man who understood him in ways no queen ever could. Roxana soon grew to despise him. She could not rival Hephaestion's history with the king. No feast, no embrace could erase the years they had spent together riding into battle and sharing command tents. When foreign emissaries addressed Hephaestion as Alexander's equal, Roxana's fury boiled. To her it wasn't politics, it was betrayal. Alexander, however, refused to choose. He loved them both in his own way, seeing no contradiction. Macedonian officers whispered that their king was losing his sense of decorum, indulging in Persian luxuries and scandalous attachments. Some even mocked him behind closed doors, calling Hephaestion the second Alexander. But none dared confront him openly. Alexander's temper was as legendary as his affection. When Roxana's jealousy became too fierce to hide, Alexander distanced himself from her. Yet she remained his wife, fiercely devoted, her influence growing quietly behind the palace walls. She understood one truth about Alexander that even Hephaestion sometimes ignored: his need to control his destiny even in matters of the heart. Then, in 324 BCE, tragedy struck. Hephaestion fell ill in Ecbatana and died suddenly. Alexander was inconsolable. He tore his clothes, refused food, and ordered temples built in Hephaestion's honour. He even declared him a demigod, an act unheard of for a mortal. The court stood in stunned silence, realizing that no one, not even Roxana, had ever commanded such devotion from him. For Roxana, Hephaestion's death brought a twisted relief, but it also left her husband hollow. She had won the war of jealousy, but at the cost of his soul. In the days that followed, Alexander wandered the palace like a ghost. The man who had conquered the world now faced a kingdom he could not subdue: grief. And soon, that grief would drive him into new alliances and new scandals. After Hephaestion's death, Alexander's grief burned into restless ambition. He needed distraction, something grand enough to drown sorrow. That something came in the form of empire. By 324 BCE, he ruled from Greece to the Indus River, yet he knew conquest alone could not bind his world together. He sought to fuse the bloodlines of Macedonia and Persia, creating a new ruling class loyal to him alone. And as with all of Alexander's visions, it began with a marriage. At Susa, the Persian ceremonial capital, he staged a spectacle the world had never seen. 90 of his leading officers were to wed noble Persian women in a mass ceremony designed to symbolize unity between East and West. At the center of it all, Alexander himself took 2 brides, Statera, the daughter of the defeated King Darius III, and Parysatis, daughter of the Persian king Artaxerxes. It was pure politics disguised as romance. The marriages cemented his claim to the Achaemenid royal line, legitimizing his rule in Persian eyes. But back in the Macedonian ranks, disgust simmered. Soldiers who had followed him through deserts and battles now watched their king dressed in Persian robes, kneeling before a foreign princess. To them, it was betrayal. A man once hailed as the defender of Greece now looked like the heir of Persia. Roxana, still queen in name, was not invited to the ceremony. Her jealousy was volcanic. She had risked everything to be Alexander's chosen, and now she was overshadowed by royal brides with higher birth and political significance. But she knew her husband well. Power moved him more than passion ever could. She remained in the shadows, calculating, silent, waiting for her moment. For Alexander, however, the union was more than symbolic. He believed himself the divine bridge between civilizations, a living embodiment of the gods. The marriages were to seal his vision of one world, one empire, one destiny. Yet even as he stood among garlands and incense, clasping the hands of Darius's daughter, murmurs of discontent echoed through his court. Macedonian officers muttered that their king was lost, no longer one of them, but a Persian in spirit. Alexander didn't care. He had wedded not just women, but entire nations. But love, power, and legacy rarely share the same bed. The weddings at Susa were meant to unify Alexander's empire, but they fractured his army instead. To the Macedonians who had marched with him from Pella, their king's new Persian identity was a bitter insult. He now wore flowing robes, demanded prostration before his throne, and spoke of himself not merely as a king, but as a living god. What had begun as admiration for their leader was slowly turning into quiet resentment. At the victory feasts, Persian nobles sat beside Macedonian officers as equals, an unthinkable sight to men who had spent years shedding blood to defeat them. Alexander's vision of cultural fusion sounded noble in theory, but in practice, it felt like betrayal. The soldiers began to whisper that their king had gone mad, that he cared more for the Persians he conquered than for the men who followed him. The real scandal came when Alexander publicly kissed one of his Persian companions, Bagoas, during a festival in front of his entire court. The gesture stunned the Macedonians. To them, such open affection between men, especially from their king, was a humiliation. Bagoas had once been a favourite of Darius III, and now he had become Alexander's. The symbolism was too much to bear. The Macedonian lion had inherited not only Persia's empire, but its courtiers and their vices. Some officers tried to remind Alexander who he was, a Greek king, not an Eastern despot. But Alexander had long since stopped listening. He surrounded himself with flatterers and mystics who called him the son of Zeus Ammon, destined to rule as a god among men. Those who resisted his transformation often met grim fates. Clytus the Black, one of his oldest companions, was slain by Alexander's own hand after daring to criticize him during a drunken quarrel. By the time the army reached Babylon, the divide was complete. The soldiers worshipped their general, but no longer understood their king. To them, he was lost, consumed by Persian luxury, blinded by love and ambition. But Alexander saw something they could not. An empire bound not by swords, but by marriage, ritual, and faith. His vision was magnificent, terrifying, and utterly his own, and it was about to consume him. Roxana's silence after the Susa weddings was not forgiveness. It was calculation. She had watched Alexander take 2 Persian princesses as wives before the eyes of the world, and though she smiled for ceremony, her fury ran deep. She had once been the only woman in his life, the symbol of his love beyond politics. Now she was a shadow beside two royal brides with greater lineage and richer dowries. But Roxana was not a woman who accepted defeat quietly. While Alexander celebrated unity, Roxana studied survival. She knew that in this new empire of blended cultures, the most dangerous battles were fought in the bedroom, not the battlefield. Her rival, Statera, the daughter of Darius, was a symbol of Persia's royal bloodline, a woman whose very existence legitimized Alexander's rule. Roxana understood what that meant. If Alexander died, Statera's son could one day inherit the empire. Roxana could not allow that. Her patience ended when Alexander fell ill in Babylon in 323 BCE. As the king's strength faded, the court fractured. Generals whispered, wives waited, and ambitions bloomed in every corridor. When the conqueror of the world finally died, chaos erupted. Roxana moved with terrifying precision. She summoned Statera and her sister to Babylon under the guise of reconciliation, then had them both murdered. Their bodies were quietly buried, their names erased. Roxana's child with Alexander would now be the only heir to his legacy. It was a ruthless act, but in the world Alexander had built, mercy was a weakness. The same woman who had once danced before him with a blade in her hand now wielded it in his absence. Macedonian officers turned pale at the rumour of her deed, yet none dared to challenge her. She was, after all, the mother of Alexander's son, and in the fragile order left behind, that gave her power few could touch. Still, vengeance came at a price. Roxana gained an empire's throne, but lost the love that had once defined her. In her attempt to protect her place in history, she became the very thing she had once feared, a pawn of politics, a queen surrounded by ghosts. Alexander had conquered nations. Roxana conquered the aftermath. The empire Alexander left behind was as vast as it was unstable, stitched together by blood, ambition, and love gone wrong. After his death, the so-called successors, his generals, tore the world apart in their struggle for power. But amid this chaos, one haunting reminder of his vision remained: the widows of Susa. The grand marriages that had once symbolized unity were now cursed relics. Most of the Macedonian officers abandoned their Persian wives the moment Alexander's body grew cold. They saw the unions for what they had always been: political theatre. The grand dream of fusion between East and West dissolved into resentment and betrayal. For every Persian woman left behind, there was a Macedonian general eager to forget the experiment. Statera, Alexander's Persian bride, was already dead, slain by Roxana's jealousy. But whispers of her ghost spread among the Persian court. Some said her spirit wandered the palace corridors of Babylon, mourning the husband who had wed her for an empire rather than for love. Her death became legend. The first blood spilled in the disintegration of Alexander's dream. Roxana, now mother of the king's only legitimate heir, Alexander IV, found herself surrounded by vultures. Generals who had once bowed to her husband now looked at her child as a pawn, a symbol to legitimize their own power grabs. She remained guarded, sharp, and ruthlessly aware that the world her husband built was turning against itself. In the east, Persian nobles lamented the loss of the Achaemenid line. To them, Alexander's marriages had been a blasphemy, a Greek conqueror trying to wear their crown. In the west, Macedonian veterans scoffed that their king had gone native, calling his Persian weddings the final proof of his corruption. The empire he had married together now divorced itself along the same cultural lines he had tried to erase. The ghosts of Susa were not just the abandoned wives or the murdered princesses. They were the dying echoes of Alexander's impossible dream. His attempt to unite hearts and empires had failed. What remained was grief, betrayal, and the slow unravelling of everything he had once held sacred. After Alexander's death, Roxana became both queen and prisoner, a woman trapped in the empire her husband had built, but could no longer hold together. Her only protection was the child she carried, Alexander's son, the infant who would be known as Alexander IV. That child was her crown, her shield, and her curse. Every general in the fractured empire saw him as a tool, the key to legitimacy in a world now ruled by ambition and steel. Roxana fled Babylon under the protection of Perdiccas, Alexander's trusted lieutenant who claimed to guard the royal family. But loyalty in this new world was as fragile as glass. The generals, Ptolemy in Egypt, Antigonus in Asia, Cassander in Macedonia, were carving up the empire piece by piece. None of them feared Roxana. They feared the name her child bore. The boy represented unity, something none of them could allow to survive. Still, Roxana played her part shrewdly. She projected the image of a grieving widow, meek and loyal, while quietly manoeuvring behind the scenes. She reminded those around her that her son was not just a prince. He was the living blood of Alexander the Great, born of both Macedonian and Persian lines. It was a story she wielded like a weapon, invoking the memory of the man no one dared openly betray. But time was cruel. The world had no place for a child king or a queen without an army. Perdiccas was soon murdered, and with his death, Roxana lost her last true ally. She and her son were taken to Macedonia, placed under the protection of Cassander, a man whose smile concealed the patience of a serpent. For years, Roxana kept the boy hidden, teaching him tales of his father's greatness, whispering that one day he would reclaim his birthright. Yet deep down, she knew the truth. Alexander's empire was dead, and so was the dream that had once bound it. By the time her son reached adolescence, Cassander no longer needed symbols. Quietly, efficiently, he ended the last chapter of Alexander's bloodline. Roxana and her son were executed in secret. The world moved on, and the widow who had once ruled the greatest empire on earth vanished, leaving only legend in her place. By the time Roxana and her son vanished from the world, Alexander's story had already begun to slip into legend. His empire had splintered, his generals had crowned themselves kings, and the dream of a united world lay in ruins. Yet amid the smoke of forgotten cities, one truth endured, that no man had ever loved, ruled, or defied convention quite like Alexander. His passions were as vast as his conquests, and his marriages revealed the soul of a man torn between love and legacy. The people of his empire told different stories depending on where they lived. To the Persians, Alexander was the foreign god-king who had tried to blend their bloodlines with Macedonian steel. To the Greeks, he was the tragic genius who lost himself to Eastern decadence. And to his soldiers, the men who had followed him through deserts and across the Hindu Kush, he was something far stranger, a man too human to be a god, yet too godlike to be fully human. His loves too became part of that mythology. Roxana, the wild beauty from the mountains, came to symbolize passion, love at first sight, fierce and doomed. Statira, the daughter of Darius, represented diplomacy and empire, the marriage of conqueror and conquered. And somewhere in between stood Hephaestion, the soulmate, the mirror of Alexander's own restless heart. Together they formed the trinity of his desire, the lover, the queen, and the companion, each embodying a different facet of who he was. The Macedonians, who once mocked his Persian customs, later told tales of divine signs at his wedding, of omens that foretold his death and glory. Poets in Alexandria compared him to Achilles and Patroclus, while Persian storytellers claimed that Roxana's child would one day return as a god reborn. Even centuries later, Roman emperors and medieval kings would look to Alexander's life for inspiration, and to his loves for warning. For in the end, Alexander's marriages were more than scandal. They were prophecy. They revealed the cost of vision, the price of uniting worlds that were never meant to merge. His empire perished, his wives died, his son was silenced. But the legend of the man who loved too boldly, ruled too widely, and lived too fiercely would never die. In the centuries that followed his death, Alexander became more myth than man. Historians chronicled his victories, Poets praised his courage, and rulers across continents sought to claim his bloodline or his blessing. But the stories that lingered most vividly were not only about the cities he burned or the kingdoms he built. They were about the people who loved him, and the ruin those loves left behind. The marriages that once scandalized his court became symbols of his contradictions. Roxana, the wild bride of passion, murdered in obscurity. Stateira, the royal bridge to Persia, slain for her lineage. Hephaestion, his companion of the soul, gone before him, leaving a void that no crown could fill. And Alexander himself, the man who thought he could unite love and empire, buried in a tomb no one can find. Together, their lives formed a tragedy as grand as any epic, not of conquest, but of the human heart. In trying to merge East and West, Alexander tried to merge himself. The Greek hero and the Persian god, the lover and the conqueror, the mortal and the divine. But his marriages revealed that no man, not even one who conquered the world, could conquer his own nature. His vision of unity had demanded love to serve politics, and politics to serve love, an impossible balance that left only blood and legend in its wake. His generals learned the lesson too late. The empires they carved from his corpse lasted mere decades before they devoured each other. The dream of a single world, born in a moment of ambition and sealed in the wedding halls of Susa, dissolved into centuries of war. What Alexander had joined through desire, history tore apart through greed, and yet perhaps that was always his fate. Men like Alexander were not meant to build peace. They were meant to burn so brightly that their ashes light the ages. His loves were the mirrors of his empire, vast, beautiful, and doomed to collapse under their own weight. In the end, Alexander left behind no heirs, no peace, and no resting place, only a legacy of brilliance, and the eternal whisper of the lovers who followed him into history's shadow. The day in a Roman legionary camp began not with sunlight, but with the sharp cry of the tuba, the Roman trumpet that cut through the morning air like a blade. Before dawn, thousands of men stirred within rows of leather tents, each soldier wrapped in his cloak, his gear neatly stacked beside him. There was no such thing as sleeping in. The Roman army valued punctuality more than comfort. Within moments, an entire camp awoke as one, a machine of men and discipline. The first task of the day was dismantling the previous night's camp. Every tent, tool, and weapon had its place. Legionaries moved with mechanical precision, folding leather tents, gathering stakes, and packing the camp's portable altars. Fires were doused, ashes buried. Not even a scrap of waste was left behind. To an untrained eye, it might have looked like chaos, but to Rome, it was art. Order forged from routine. Soon came breakfast, usually cold bread, cheese and water or sour wine, eaten quickly and in silence. Officers barked orders while centurions paced the lines, checking that every man was properly equipped. Helmets gleamed, sandals were strapped tight, and shields rested against packs that could weigh nearly 30 kilograms. Each soldier carried his own kit, cooking tools, stakes for palisades, rations, and personal gear. Rome didn't rely on servants. The legionary was the army. Then came the march. The cornice blew another signal, and like clockwork, the legions fell into formation. The standard-bearers raised the eagles high, and the column began to move, thousands of iron-clad feet striking the earth in unison. Dust rose, birds scattered, and the sound of marching boots rolled across the land like thunder. They would walk for miles before stopping, the empire's unstoppable tide inching forward one measured step at a time. Yet before nightfall, they would build again. A new fortress rising from the ground with the same precision as the last. Every camp, every trench, every wall was part of the rhythm of empire. This was the secret of Rome's strength, not just its swords, but its discipline. Even at dawn, when the world still slept, the legions were already at work, turning wilderness into civilization, one trumpet call at a time. Once the last trumpet call faded, the march began, not in chaos, but in flawless precision. A Roman legion on the move was the most disciplined sight the ancient world had ever seen. Tens of thousands of men, each carrying nearly half their body weight in armour and gear, moved in tight formation along roads carved by their own hands. The columns stretched for miles, but every step, every pause, and every command followed the same rhythm, as if the entire army shared one heartbeat. The order of march was sacred. Scouts rode ahead to secure the route, followed by engineers and surveyors who measured distances and marked where the next camp would be built. Behind them came the vexillari, the standard bearers, carrying banners that identified each unit. Then came the legionaries, shoulder to shoulder, their shields strapped to their backs and their armour clinking in unison. The sound was hypnotic. Iron, dust, and determination. Each man carried his world with him. His sarcina, the marching pack that contained tools, rations, spare sandals, stakes for palisades, a cooking pot, and a few personal tokens. The soldiers called themselves Muli Mariani, Marius's mules, after the general who had once reformed the legions to carry their own burdens. They grumbled, but they carried on. Complaining was allowed, stopping was not. Centurions marched at the edges of the column, their vine staffs ready to strike at anyone who broke formation. Discipline was absolute. If a soldier dropped out without permission, he risked lashes or worse. The Romans believed that fear and pride kept men in line, and both were present in abundance. The heat of the day brought exhaustion. Dust stuck to sweat, and armour bit into shoulders. Yet the legions marched relentlessly, often covering 20 miles before noon. To them, hardship was routine. Comfort was weakness. Even the generals, including Caesar himself, often walked beside their men, showing that Rome's greatness was built not by nobles, but by endurance. When the day's journey ended, no rest awaited them. The second trumpet would sound soon, the signal that marked the next stage of their endless ritual. For Roman soldiers, the march was never over. Each day ended where the next fortress began. As the day's march drew to a close, the legions halted at the signal of the trumpet. But their work was far from over. The moment a suitable spot was chosen, ideally a flat area near water and away from ambush points, the Roman army transformed from a marching column into an army of engineers. Every evening, they built an entire fortified camp from scratch. The Praefectus Castrorum, camp prefect, and his surveyors began the process. Using wooden staffs, measuring cords, and a device called the groma, they laid out the precise dimensions of the camp. Every camp followed the same pattern, regardless of terrain or distance marched that day. The Romans could take a patch of wilderness and turn it into a miniature city in less than a few hours. Legionaries dropped their heavy packs, picked up shovels, axes and pickaxes, and began to dig. Ditches were carved in perfect rectangles, usually 2 meters deep, surrounding the camp like a moat. The earth from the trenches was piled inward to form a rampart, the foundation of the vallum, or defensive wall. Wooden stakes were driven in to create a palisade, sharp as spears, ready to repel attackers. Every man had his duty. The engineers oversaw construction, the legionaries dug and hammered, and the centurions roamed the site like hawks, ensuring the walls were straight and the work relentless. Even exhausted from the day's march, no soldier dared slack off. Discipline was survival. A careless hand could doom thousands if an enemy struck by night. Inside the walls, order ruled. Streets were marked out in perfect right angles, with the main road, the Via Principalis, dividing the camp. The general's tent stood at the centre, surrounded by headquarters, armories and granaries. Each cohort had its designated space, every tent lined up as neatly as a row of tiles. When the final stake was hammered and the trench completed, the tuba sounded again. The men exhaled, not in rest, but in readiness. Fires were lit, guards posted, and sentries took their stations. From above, a Roman camp glowed like a pattern of stars, geometry forged in discipline and iron. Every night they built safety with their own hands. Every dawn they would tear it down again. As twilight settled, the newly built fortress pulsed with order and routine. Within the freshly dug walls of the camp, there was no confusion, only purpose. Every street, tent, and pathway had meaning, laid out with mathematical precision. The Romans did not merely camp, they constructed civilization wherever they stopped. At the very centre stood the praetorium, the commander's tent. It was larger than any other, marked by standards fluttering in the evening breeze. Here, the general would plan the next day's march, issue orders, and dine surrounded by his officers. Maps were spread across wooden tables, candles flickered against bronze armour, and decisions that would shape empires were made over bread and wine. Around the praetorium lay the administrative heart of the camp, the Principia, where records were kept, pay distributed, and messages received. It also served as a shrine for the legion standards, sacred emblems that soldiers swore to defend with their lives. Losing a standard was considered worse than death. Regaining one could redeem an entire legion's honour. To one side stood the Quaestorium, a guarded area holding the army's supplies, food, weapons, siege tools, and the treasury. Every item was counted, sealed, and recorded. The Romans understood that war was not won by swords alone, but by logistics. Grain and discipline were as vital as courage and steel. Farther out, rows of leather tents filled the camp, perfectly aligned like the streets of a city. Each contubernium, a group of 8 soldiers, shared one tent and a small cooking area. Here, men joked, argued, and mended gear. The smell of wood smoke and boiled lentils drifted through the air. Laughter mixed with the clang of armour being repaired and the rhythmic scrape of whetstones on blades. Evening meals were humble. Barley porridge, cheese, dried meat, and watered wine. Yet for men who had marched for miles and dug for hours, it was a feast. Centurions walked the lines, ensuring discipline, while engineers checked fortifications. Every sound had order, every task a reason. As night deepened, torches burned in even intervals, casting long shadows across the camp's streets. The praetorium glowed faintly at its heart, a reminder that this was not just a resting place, but a living fortress, beating in perfect Roman rhythm. As the camp settled into evening, the daily rhythm of a Roman legionary continued, one built on order, repetition, and endurance. There was no leisure, only the illusion of rest. Every action, even the simplest, had its place within the structure of military discipline. After constructing the fortifications, soldiers turned to maintenance. Armour had to be polished, weapons sharpened, and shields inspected for cracks. Neglect was not tolerated. Rust and dull edges could mean death in battle. The camp rang with the rasp of whetstones, the creak of leather being repaired, and the quiet murmur of men speaking Latin, Greek, or native dialects. 1,000 tongues bound by the same iron code. Dinner came next. Each contubernium, a group of 8 men, gathered around their small fire to cook a shared meal. The food was simple: barley porridge, beans, cheese, sometimes a piece of salted pork. It wasn't much, but it was consistent, and in the Roman army, consistency was survival. Soldiers carried their own cooking tools, their own grain, and even their own mills. A Roman legion was self-sufficient, a mobile city that fed, armed, and maintained itself without depending on local supplies. Once fed, the men cleaned their area meticulously. Waste was buried, tools neatly arranged, and fires extinguished except for those kept for watch duties. Order was sacred. An untidy camp was a punishable offence. The centurions made their rounds, inspecting tents and checking lists. They were the backbone of the army, hard men who enforced Rome's will with both courage and cruelty. As dusk deepened, the tuba sounded again, the signal for the evening watch. Guards took positions along the ramparts and gates, their torches flickering against the new walls they had built only hours before. Beyond the camp's perimeter stretched wilderness, forests, hills, or barren plains filled with the unknown. Inside, all was control. Outside, chaos waited. before sleep, prayers were offered. Some soldiers whispered to Mars for strength, others to household gods far from home. Then came silence, a heavy, disciplined stillness broken only by footsteps of sentries and the distant hoot of owls. For the legionary, peace was not the absence of war. It was the brief calm between trumpet calls. As darkness blanketed the camp, the illusion of rest gave way to vigilance. The Romans never slept carelessly. They understood that danger did not vanish with daylight. Each night, strict order governed who watched, who slept, and who would answer for failure. The Vigiliae Nocturni, or night watches, divided the hours between sunset and dawn into 4 shifts. Every soldier knew when he was to guard, and every centurion knew that a single mistake could destroy them all. At the start of the first watch, the tribune and senior centurions inspected the sentries stationed along the vallum, the earthen wall crowned with wooden stakes. Torches flickered across the perimeter, their glow bouncing off iron helmets. Sentries stood at regular intervals, peering into the night beyond the trench. They carried spears and wore their armour even while guarding, for attack could come at any moment. A raiding party, a band of thieves, or worse, a stealthy enemy waiting for sleep to dull the Roman edge. Each guard shift lasted roughly 3 hours, marked by the rhythmic sound of the bucina, the curved horn that signalled the change of watch. When one guard's duty ended, another replaced him seamlessly. No shift was ever empty, no gate was ever unwatched. If a soldier was caught sleeping on duty, punishment was swift and brutal, often death by stoning or beating at the hands of his comrades. Discipline in the legions was not mere obedience, it was survival. Fear of dishonour ran deeper than fear of pain. To let down one's cohort was to invite the scorn of every man who trusted his life to your vigilance. Inside the camp, the rest of the soldiers lay in their tents, sleeping lightly beneath their cloaks, their shields stacked by the entrance, ready at a moment's notice. Even in slumber, a Roman legion was a weapon poised to strike. Occasionally, officers made silent rounds to ensure order was maintained. A single shout, "Signa ferte!" to arms, could rouse the entire camp in minutes. Outside the palisade, the world was silent. The faint rustle of wind through trees, the crackle of torches, the metallic breath of soldiers standing watch. Within that disciplined darkness, Rome's true strength revealed itself. Not in conquest, but in control. Before dawn, the camp stirred once again to the sound of the tuba. To the legionary, morning meant movement, and movement meant dismantling everything he had built the night before. Rest was temporary. Permanence belonged only to Rome itself. Within minutes, thousands of men were awake, rolling up cloaks, stamping out dying embers, and collapsing tents with practiced efficiency. Every tent and stake had its exact place, and each man knew his part. 8 soldiers to a tent, each responsible for one section of the contubernium. Some folded the leather coverings, others packed the wooden poles or gathered the cooking tools. Nothing was left behind, not even the ashes from last night's fires. The Romans prided themselves on leaving no trace of their presence except the straight line of a road and the echo of discipline. As the sky lightened, the quaestors oversaw the packing of supplies, food rations, siege equipment, and the portable altars used for daily sacrifices. The camp prefect checked the walls one last time before giving the signal to strike them down. In less than an hour, the fortress that had guarded 10,000 men vanished, its walls reduced to piles of earth, its gates taken apart plank by plank. The legions formed up once more, armour gleaming with dew, shields strapped to their backs, tools hanging from belts. Every soldier's pack weighed nearly 30 kilograms, a burden carried without complaint. The centurions inspected their ranks, ensuring not a single helmet strap or sandal was out of order. Perfection wasn't vanity, it was survival. Before marching, the augur performed a short ritual, reading the omens, the flight of birds, the shape of the smoke from the morning fires. The soldiers watched in silence. To defy an omen was to risk disaster, to follow it was to honour the gods of war. Only when the priest nodded did the trumpet sound again, and then, With the rising sun glinting off bronze and iron, the column began to move. Dust rose from the earth as the legions left behind another invisible city, a fortress that had existed for one night only. For the Roman soldier, the pattern never changed. Build, rest, dismantle, march. Their days were endless repetition, their purpose eternal. Once the camp was dismantled, the army began its daily pilgrimage through empire, a moving city of discipline, sweat, and iron. The morning air was sharp, filled with the sounds of clinking armor and the rhythmic thud of sandals on packed earth. The legions marched in perfect formation, each man keeping pace to the beat of the cornicen's horn. To watch them move was to see order made flesh, an army so precise that even nature seemed to step aside. At the front rode the scouts and engineers, clearing obstacles and marking the route. Behind them came the standard-bearers, holding the sacred eagles high. Each banner fluttered with pride, the embodiment of Rome's soul. The legionaries followed, divided by cohort, their red cloaks swaying in the wind. Every few miles trumpets blared, signals to rest, adjust formation, or resume the march. The Roman army didn't wander, it measured the world in footsteps. Every man carried not only weapons, but civilization itself. Roads were carved as they advanced, ditches filled, and bridges built where none existed. To follow a Roman legion was to follow progress, for in their wake came trade, law, and the Latin tongue. Villages trembled as they passed, not just from fear, but from awe. Rome's power was not in brutality alone, but in the precision of her soldiers, who could fight like wolves and build like gods. The pace was relentless. A full day's march could cover up to 20 miles beneath the sun, armor heating like an oven. The dust clung to sweat, and every breath tasted of metal and earth. Yet the men never faltered. Centurions barked commands, striking laggards with their vine staffs. To fall behind was humiliation. To endure was honor. Occasionally the column crossed rivers, their engineers throwing up bridges from timber and rope in a matter of hours. Even the smallest delay was unacceptable. Rome's armies did not wait. They made the world move for them. By late afternoon the horizon shimmered with heat. The men's shadows grew long and fatigue set in. But the order never broke. The tuba would soon sound again, not to rest, but to build. For wherever they stopped, Rome would rise anew from the dust, one fortress at a time. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the Roman legions prepared for the cycle to begin again. The day might have ended, but the machine of empire did not rest. When the order came to halt, the engineers rode ahead to mark the next camp's perimeter, driving stakes into the ground and planting flags to designate where each cohort would stand. Behind them, the soldiers arrived in waves, weary, sweating, silent, and once more began their nightly ritual of creation. The land itself bent to Roman design. Trenches were dug, ramparts raised, palisades hammered together in rhythmic unity. Fires flickered along the perimeter, their glow spreading across the plain like molten gold. The legionaries worked swiftly, almost mechanically. They had done this so many times that even exhaustion could not slow them. It was muscle memory, a civilization's heartbeat echoing through the hands of men. By nightfall, the new fortress was complete, perfectly measured, fortified, and alive. Officers dined near the praetorium, eating from bronze plates and discussing maps under lamplight. The rank and file gathered by their fires, joking, gambling with dice or telling stories of home, of farms in Latium, wives in Campania, or the taste of wine from Gaul. Yet even in these brief moments of warmth, discipline never slept. Guards rotated through their shifts, scouts slipped beyond the walls to monitor the dark, and centurions paced the lines, their eyes sharp as blades. From a distance, the camp looked like a star fallen to earth, a square of light, geometric and unyielding, surrounded by blackness. Every fortress, every trench, every footprint carved into the soil was a statement that Rome could impose order anywhere. Wilderness became gridwork. Night became day. When morning came, the trumpets would sound again. The walls would fall, the camp would vanish, and the army would move on, leaving behind nothing but the faint imprint of perfection. For the Roman legionary, life was an endless march between creation and destruction, between chaos and command. This was how Rome conquered the world, not merely through war, but through habit. Through the rhythm of men who built a fortress each night, tore it down each dawn, and called it peace. The empire slept in no bed, because Rome itself never slept.